that we have to continue not to free ourselves, but to also like free our minds from this notion that we could be frivolous.
Yeah. I think the thing that probably sticks out most to me is the injustice in allocation and distribution piece. In hosting, several public hearings and public events across the state, we've heard very loud verbal outcry from the public with respect to specificity on who receives reparations. And begin to kind of wrestle with that question as a commission. I mean, in our bill language, a lot of our actions are designed specifically to impact those who are descendants of slavery, African American descendants of slavery. But how do you figure out who those individuals are? Because in data, all you see is African American or Black, right? So that's a question, one that we're looking to look at. But even going a little deeper than that, you know, talking about the Black codes in Illinois, right? There is a problem with teaching of history, right? So many individuals think about Illinois and immediately think Illinois was a free state. And they don't know that Illinois actually did have slavery in instances, right? That Illinois actually was very restrictive to emancipated Black individuals who moved to the state. That there were these things called Black codes between 1818 and 1853 that restricted the movements and freedoms of Black individuals, right? So, like, no right to vote. I couldn't testify if I saw a white individual commit a crime. For me, as a free Black person, to even come to the state of Illinois, I have to put up $1,000 bond. If more than 3 Black people gathered in one space, we can all be jailed and enslaved. So, like, these types of movements and restrictions, they happen to a very specific group of individuals that at the time were called Black, but we know them now as those who are descendants of the emancipated or the emancipated themselves. So I think that we have to make some distinctions when we try to make these harm-based reparations claims to actually tie the harm to the individuals who experienced the harm and their descendants.
Thank you both. And so kind of talking about that kind of response of policy, when we asked people what policy ideas that they wanted to see be included in reparations, many ideas came up. And so we wanted to ask of this, almost 600 group of people, what their response would be to 6 of the most frequently discussed policy ideas that had come from our conversations, recognizing, to Patrice's point earlier, that there are no assumptions about what reparations could be. We're just having conversation about what people are thinking right now and what they might be hoping reparations could be. And so, direct cash payments came, as the number one. I think Marvin, you said low hanging fruit earlier. So people, said that they wanted direct cash payments, but also folks were curious about educational grants and scholarships, homeowner and housing tax credit, debt relief, free access to health and wellness care, ending discrimination against people with criminal records, and folks had other ideas that were included. But these ones kind of rose to the surface as just being most frequently talked about. And so in thinking of this, like, what other reparations policies have you heard from your communities? And specific to direct cash payments, what would that actually look like if that were implemented in Illinois? And Marvin, if you want to go first.
Yeah, there are a few different things that the commission is tasked with looking at specifically. The building and developing of a vocational center, vocational training center for people of African descent citizens, ensuring proportional economic representation in all state contracts, and the creation and enforcement of an Illinois slavery era disclosure bill, right? So those are some of the things that are very specific that we are working on as reparatory actions, because we see a dearth of individuals who are entering into the trades, who are Black African American, and more specifically those who are descendants of slavery. We see African American neighborhoods, and trying to preserve those African American neighborhoods is relatively difficult because of the increased tax burden, property tax burden, right? And then the relative wealth position of Black Americans. Even looking at the Chicago Community Trust and their state, what was it, the Color of Wealth Chicago report, which basically outlined that Black citizens in Chicago have a net wealth position of $0. So it really can't get worse. I mean, it can go negative, but you know, when you even think about to the last question, why is it so imperative? Why is it so important? Well, when you look at crime, you look at unemployment, you look at the educational attainment of those who are Black in the city of Chicago is directly linked to the fact that we have zero assets. And making sure that even looking at some of the information that is on the slide, a lot of the direct cash payments, educational grants and scholarships, home ownership and housing tax credits, debt relief, these things are equity building things. We're literally talking about things that improve that upward social mobility in an economic way, right? So we can almost lump some of these specific policies into economic empowerment based policies and more health and wellness based policies, right? So we talk about individuals who want psychological services, mental health, healthcare, right? Like that's one part of it, but then you have the part that is more economic in nature. So I think as a commission, we are open to listening to the needs of the community and attempting to make recommendations based off of those needs.
I wanted to add a bit because when I was looking at this list, I think something that we've recently been talking about at IBAI is like what is reparations versus what is actually just good government that is equitable across all racial, ethnic groups, class groups in the country. And so I think we want to be careful when I'm thinking about this, like ending discrimination against people with criminal records in particular, some of the homeowner and housing tax, like I think we want to be careful about saying, is that reparations or is this just actually good government? This is actually how a government should treat its citizens. If you have gone to prison, you have quote unquote served your debt to society, should there be permanent punishments that follow that? I don't know if we should call those things reparations. And so I think this is important and this nuance is important because again, we are talking about a debt that is owed versus and not just like good government. And I think we will not get what is owed if we only sort of demand things that should actually just always have been in existence. But I do think, given the disparate impact of education in this country, reduced tuition in universities that engaged in intentional segregation and discrimination, I think could be a good uh, reparative offering. I think at IBAI, when we think about direct compensation, we think about it generally people who have Black identities. And then, in addition, when there are clear connections to or linkages to chattel slavery, clear connections to Jim Crow and et cetera. But I think my big point on this is to actually make sure that we are asking for things that are truly reparative, and not things that should actually just exist.
Great, thank you both. So we touched on it a little bit around reparations eligibility. And this was a very diverse response from the folks who participated with us. And, recognizing that some people said that descendants of chattel slavery should be getting reparations, Black Americans as an identity, specifically elderly or socioeconomically disadvantaged Black Americans. Some folks felt that you should be able to exhibit certain behaviors or personal responsibility in order to get reparations. Some folks said that there should be a proof of harm to be able to prove that either your family was enslaved or those sorts of connections. And there were some people who just absolutely were in opposition. And again, these are all Black people in Illinois. Folks felt that no one should get reparations. We also uniquely asked, how would you decide who would get reparations if you were in charge? But there was a certain subset of folks who said that you refused to answer the question because they didn't want to be the decision makers. And I found that really curious. And so I wanted to ask you, why do you think ideas of eligibility for reparations carry such a diverse response among Black people? And a little bit more of the nuances that you've experienced in your work around eligibility.
I mean, in my personal professional opinion, not speaking on behalf of the Illinois Reparations Commission, but America has an issue with flat blackness. We flatten the Black experience based on melanin and not on experience. There is something that is intrinsically different between an individual who came here on a plane versus those who were stolen and brought here in chains. And that bears out in the socioeconomic status of those individuals, right? If you look at the combined total of all of the color of wealth reports in America, you see these striking differences. When you look at those who are native born Black Americans versus individuals who are born in our diasporic cousins countries, right? Like you see they are oftentimes more educated, they earn more, they are married at higher clips. Like you see all of this really striking data, and I think that it's important for us to be able to look at that and try to co-interpret what it means, right? So when we talk about eligibility, it's not a bad thing to be different, and it's not a terrible thing to notice those differences, and it's going to be important for us to be able to talk openly about those differences in order to actually prescribe solutions to individuals that will work. So when I think about eligibility, a lot of folks will talk about how divisive it is. I don't think it's divisive. What I think is truly divisive is flattening the experience across all individuals and then giving everybody the exact same thing simply because they are this.
Thanks, Marvin. Patrice?
I will be honest, it's complicated for me because given that this is Black people talking to Black people, I always wonder at what point are we negotiating against ourselves? Um, and why are we so hung up on the question of eligibility? I think is it because we are concerned that there's only so much money out there? And so we need to be able to make sure there's enough for everybody. Is there a question? Is there a question of um, do we truly believe that there are some of us who should get it and who should not get it? I think that that's what I am more interested in unpacking a bit. Because I guess the question is to me is like, well, I get it. I understand folks who are brought over in chains versus who flew on a plane to get here. I get it. I do, and I think that that is something worth unpacking for our communities and the culture. But I when I see this question, I feel a little bit of frustration, I think, because I worry that we are betting against ourselves. We are negotiating against ourselves in some way. I think at this point we just say Black Americans and go from there and let other folks argue why not. I think we have to have some unity at the beginning at this stage versus already, well, you have to have these things to even be a part of the conversation. I think that I think I'm just like troubled by the premise, I think, a bit. Given what it's going to take to win reparations, I think that we don't want to start excluding people at the outset.
I mean, I think that gets at a core component of how we think, the wrongness of how we think about coalition building, right? Coalition building shouldn't be just because you're gonna get personal benefit from it. It should be based on the fact that I actually care about this issue. It's a human right, and I see that this particular group was harmed, so I want to help this particular group out of me empathizing with their humanity, not because I benefit personally. And I think that when we start talking about reparations, it's always a conversation of reparations for what exactly. I think that we sometimes get kind of caught in the weeds, and other times we're too high level. Where most individuals are talking about reparations for chattel slavery and its vestiges, right? Like the legacy of it. There are some individuals who have experienced the full nine. They experienced everything from chattel slavery all the way to New Jim Crow. And there are other individuals who haven't experienced the fullness of it, and it probably is wise of us to unpack what that means in real terms for our community.
Thank you. You mentioned coalition building, and that takes us to another question that we asked around civic engagement. And so we wanted to see like what people really felt around what it means to be engaged in their society and build for social change. And so we asked this question, and we found that